Well, the idea of a web documentary, given the purpose of our centre, seemed appropriate as a way of marking that Keynes died 70 years ago on the 21st of April 1946. And indeed, in February of 36, 80 years ago, he published his final great book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. So it's a year of anniversaries of Keynes, and it seemed appropriate to mark them, because when Keynes died, he was truly one of the great figures of the 20th century. He ranked up there with Einstein and other people in terms of his influence on the world, and in terms of particularly his contribution to shaping the post-war world, which he wanted very much to be obviously a world of peace and harmony and prosperity, and having been through two world wars, the horrible 1914-18 experience and then this awful Second World War. The 20th century, as historians have said, is probably been the bloodiest century in history, and Keynes was very sensitive to that and to the need to make sure that economic relations promoted peace and reconciliation. And that goes back to his first major book he wrote after the First World War, when he was a civil servant at the Versailles Treaty negotiations and resigned on matters of principle because of the way the political leaders were treating the vanquished Germans. He foresaw that this would lead to further trouble and further war, and he wrote his amazing book, The Economic Consequences of Peace, which established his name internationally right at the start. And one has to remember, this was a relatively young civil servant who had the courage to stand up and state his principles and say the politics was, in his view, evil, and to write a polemic which has withstood the test of time in terms of its wisdom far better than the political leaders who were purportedly shaping a world for peace. Anyway, we got another war, as Keynes actually foresaw, and during that war he made obviously heroic efforts to deal with problems of financing the war without inflation and so on. But he made huge efforts about the post-war world, and indeed these efforts probably wore his heart down, and he died shortly after the Savannah Conference of basically a weak heart and it giving out. So here's a great figure of the 20th century who essentially sacrificed his health and his well-being, his life, for all of us, gave us through his ideas and thinking decades of prosperity, and has given us resources for thinking about the world in which we live today still. So it seemed appropriate that it should be noted, at least by a centre calling itself the Keynes Centre, in a modern format of a web documentary. And you'll see from that the person that we call Keynes, the economist, was a man of extraordinary diversity, extraordinary talent and extraordinary humanity. And it's worth having a look just to see that this person was truly one of the greatest figures since the 20th century.